Hello, welcome to episode 3 of the Curious Wanderer Bible Study. A particular point of the last episode, episode 2, about the fall, piqued my curiosity, and I wanted to explore it with you all a little bit. In the last episode, we discussed the fall in Genesis 3, in particular starting with the serpent tempting Eve, and then the fallout, and then God calling Adam back, and more fallout, etc. But what I wanted to explore was the dialogue between Eve and Satan, because it reveals some deep patterns about how sin insinuates itself into our lives. And there were some subtleties there that just tickled the back of my brain, and I wanted to go through them. So, there are 3 parts of the dialogue that lead to the fall, 3 bits of conversation. So let's go through it. So first, he, the serpent / Satan, said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" So we're starting in 3, the beginning of 3. So that's the first part. The second part is, "And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.'" That's the second part of the dialogue. And the third part is the serpent responding to the woman. "But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" And then the woman decides to eat. So 3 parts, and then the woman is convinced. But the dialogue is interesting. So, the very first part of it, did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? Is a really interesting question that the serpent asks Eve. Notice, of course, the general pattern there, that the serpent is causing Eve to question God. Did God actually say? But then the actual phrasing there is weird, strange. So, there are other ways the serpent could have asked that would have been far more natural, to me at least. So rather than saying, "You shall not eat," did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? The serpent could have just said, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge'?" Just a direct question of what God actually said. Simple, direct, and asking that. He could have, and it would have seemed more natural to me for the serpent to ask that question. Or another question he could have asked instead is, did God actually say you can eat all of the fruit of the garden? Because that's what he wants her to do, eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So why didn't he just ask her that way? Much more direct, getting to what he wants. Or he could have asked the other direct way, did God actually say, "You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge"? Direct to the point. But he goes this other convoluted route. Why? I think there are a couple of reasons. So the first is asking the question in that phrasing casts God in a negative light. So when he says, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" it makes God seem super controlling, even though it's not actually what God said. When the serpent asked that, it makes it feel like psychologically that God is really controlling, which of course he's not. He can do anything except this one thing. That's all, just one thing. But instead it makes it feel like he is unreasonable. You can't do anything. God's being crazy with you. When in fact, that's exactly the opposite. You can do so many things. Just this one thing, stay away from. So the first reason the serpent would phrase the question this way is because it makes God look bad, which is what he wants. But the second point is that I think the question phrased that way knocks Eve off balance because it's unexpected. The question is so vastly different from what God said. I think it would have taken Eve some time to respond, to gather her wits. She would have been knocked off balance. And then there's a third sort of neat logical, psychological problem with answering that question. So the question, as phrased by the serpent, did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree"? So what is the logical opposite of you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? So basic logic sentences, to find the opposite, you either add a not in it, the N-O-T, or remove a not, N-O-T. So the opposite of I am blonde is I am not blonde. The opposite of I am tall is I am not tall. The opposite of I am not fat is that I am fat. So you either add a not or remove a not in basic logic. When we do that with this question, we get you shall eat of any tree in the garden, removing that not. Instead of you shall not eat of any tree in the garden, you get you shall eat of any tree in the garden, which is what the serpent wants to convince her of, that she can eat of any tree, in particular the tree of knowledge. But this is not the logical opposite of you shall not eat of any tree in the garden. The logical opposite of that is you can eat of at least one tree in the garden. That's the logical opposite. And it's effectively one version of what God says. God says you can eat of anything except for one tree, which means there's a whole lot of trees that you can eat of. But the logical opposite of you shall not eat of any tree is you can eat of at least one tree. So logically we may know that, but psychologically it's difficult not to jump to the first version subconsciously, that you can eat of any tree. And that is what the serpent is counting on. So this beginning question shows us how sin begins to enter into our life. First, it causes us to question God. That's literally what the serpent is doing. That questioning knocks us off balance in our faith and tempts us with something that we want, and we want it for free. It confuses us about what we know, what we really know. And that's what all of these things are happening here in that very first question. So once the question is asked, I think Eve, it feels like to me that Eve is off balance. And so all she can actually do is quote the rule. And I want you to think about this for a minute. Recall that the rule was given to Adam in 2:16. And I'll quote it here. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Right after that, after God gives Adam that command, he creates Eve, which means he didn't at least at first give Eve this knowledge. He gave it to Adam. And I'm only left to speculate here, but it feels as if Eve probably got this information then from Adam, which would mean that this rule is less solidly in her heart and mind than it was for Adam. So, and then the serpent hits home with his response to her. So she quotes back the rule to him. And then the serpent hits home with his response. And this is when the serpent finally lies. And this was when kind of the pattern of sin would finally lie to us. So in part of Genesis 3:4 and 3:5, we hear, You will not surely die. This is the serpent speaking. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So here the serpent actually lies. He lies about the consequences, death. You surely won't die. In fact, he knows, and we know they will. But the second part of that sentence in 3:5, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The serpent is playing up this false idea that God would be jealous of us, that we would be like God, and that God is afraid of us being like him. When in fact, it's the opposite. God knows that once they sin, they will surely die, and he is afraid for them. He is not afraid of them. He is afraid for them, for the consequences that they are going to have to experience. But the serpent plays it up the other way, that God is afraid of them, that he's jealous of them. And this is how sin plays out in our lives. After we get knocked off balance, it spreads the lies that there's no consequences, and it also spreads the lie that it will give you something super amazing. Okay, last, we have Eve's decision. So we've had the 3 parts where the serpent causes Eve to question God, Eve responds, and then the serpent lies fully to try and get her in. And it works. We see the pattern of how he succumbed to sin in her response. So in Genesis 3:6, it says, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate." So, Eve, quote, saw that the tree was good for food, from the verse, i.e., she saw that it was possible to eat it. So she noticed that it was not just decorative fruit, but fruit that she could eat. So it was possible for her to sin. That was the first part. And it even looked good. And doesn't sin look good when it's tempting you? She said, she saw, and quote from the verse, that it was a delight to the eyes. So it wasn't just like it looked okay. It was really enticing. And then she saw it could give her the thing that she actually wanted, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. So let's recap. For the final fall, there were 3 steps. First, noticing that she could sin, that the fruit was actually edible. Noticing how enticing it looked. That's the first part. Second part, how enticing it looked just to eat it. And then the third part, that she would get immediately, without any work, what she wanted. Wisdom in that case. And this is the pattern for how sin gets us. We notice first that we can do it, whether or not we should. Sin makes itself look really beautiful and alluring, that we would want it, and that we get something for nothing out of it. One last note about all of this. So we've been talking about Eve and the serpent, but where's Adam when all of this is happening? I mean, he's there somewhere, right? Well, we can figure out where he's at because we see at the end of 3:6 that she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. So we know where Adam was while the serpent was talking to her. He was with her the whole time. He could have interrupted at any point, but he did not. He was kind of a coward, honestly. We all go through those points where we're cowards when someone needs us and we don't speak up. He was actually in the stronger position than Eve because he was not being lied to and tempted directly by Satan, by the serpent. He could have helped. He was in the stronger position to help, but he didn't. But this shows us a pattern of what we should be doing with family and friends when we see that there's a problem with them, what they're doing with something in their behavior. We should help. We're not being tempted, and we can help those who are. We are in the stronger position, and we can help them make it through those things. Obviously, you have to have the right relationship with a person to do that, but when you do, and clearly Adam had the right relationship with Eve to do that, he didn't, and we see the consequence. And even at the very end, he, quote, takes and eats. He could have declined at that point, but instead he just goes along with the crowd. How much evil has been perpetrated on this world by folks just going along with the crowd? We see in Adam's behavior at the end of this a pattern of what not to do when we see sin infiltrating the lives of people we love. Okay, well, thank you for your time, and I hope you found this enjoyable. We'll see you next time.